I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we are meeting. Tonight, the human tragedy unfolding in the Middle East. Israel says a ground invasion of Gaza is inevitable unless Hamas surrenders. And the Prime Minister arrives in Washington for talks with Joe Biden. AUKUS, energy and the economy are all on the agenda. Joining our panel, Middle East analyst Roger Shanahan, a former Australian Army officer who served in Beirut and Syria. CEO of Get Up, Larissa Baldwin-Roberts, a proud Bundjalung woman. Assistant Minister for Defence, Veterans Affairs and the Republic, Matt Thistlethwaite. Leader of the Australian Greens, Adam Bant, the member for Melbourne. And Nationals member for Hinkler, Keith Pitt, a former Minister for Resources and Water. Also tonight, what does the Voice outcome mean for future referendums? Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Qantas is the hashtag. Please get involved. Before we get to the first question, we'll bring you the topic of tonight's online poll. We're asking you, after the defeat of the Voice referendum, will Australia ever become a republic? You can cast your votes anonymously on the Q&A Facebook and YouTube accounts or the ABC X and Instagram accounts. And we'll bring you, of course, the results later and a bit of a discussion on that too. Let's start tonight with our first question, and that's from Thomas Klein.
Yes, I have a very simple question. I would like the panelists to tell us what they would do if they would be the Prime Minister of Israel.
Roger, what would you do if you're the Prime Minister of Israel?
Yeah, well, listen, I think he's indicated what he is going to do. He's failed on his watch to provide security to Israel, so he has to act to make sure that that deterrence capability that has protected Israel over the years is reinstated, and that means, unfortunately, a ground incursion into Gaza and the degradation of Hamas's capabilities to a degree that means that it won't be able to threaten the state of Israel for the foreseeable future. People talk about destroying it. It's not practical to destroy it, but it's practical to degrade it. I think that's really the only option that he has. And for the rest of the world, they need to hold Israel to account to make sure that it prosecutes that operation within international humanitarian law, but also understanding that Hamas is guilty of a horrendous terrorist act, and they still hold a large number of foreign nationals as hostages and also Israeli citizens as hostages, and they've postured themselves within Gaza against international humanitarian law within and amongst the civilian population. So it's a very difficult problem, but I don't think there is any alternative other than a ground incursion.
OK. I'm going to go next to Matt. Is that your view too? Because there are some people saying there should be a ceasefire. In your view, does there have to be a ground incursion? Is that what you would do if you were Israeli Prime Minister?
Well, if I was the Israeli Prime Minister, I would act to defend the citizens of my nation, and that would include attempting to have the hostages released. Hamas, a terrorist organisation, unprovoked, attacked and killed and slaughtered Israeli citizens. People that were at a dance party enjoying themselves were brutally gunned down. So Israel has the right to defend itself, and the motion that was passed in the Parliament last week that was moved by the Prime Minister and seconded by the opposition leader, I spoke in support of that motion. So I think Israel has the right to defend itself, but as Roger said, it has to act within the bounds of international law and uphold the sanctity of civilian lives.
So this is the question. If you were the Prime Minister of Israel, and clearly none of you were going to be, but if you were...
There's still time. Still time.
Very ambitious of you. But would you do it the same way? Because some of your colleagues, in fact, I interviewed on RM Breakfast last week, Ed Husick, a cabinet minister who says this looks like collective punishment.
Well, Israel has acted to warn people in Gaza that there is a ground incursion coming.
Well, where would they go?
And advise them to move south to safety. So Israel has warned people. I think the point that Ed and Anne have been making is the importance of the sanctity of civilian lives on both sides of this conflict for Palestinians and for Israelis. And that goes to the importance of upholding international laws that do exist for conflicts such as this.
Larissa?
I think that there have been millions of people protesting over the last weekend across the world and calling for a peaceful resolution to the situation. Incredibly worried about the images that we are seeing come out of Israel and Gaza. There is no military solution here. And I think it is incumbent on us to call on our leaders. We are military allies with the US to call for a ceasefire. Because what is happening here, where does this end? And I think for many people, for many ordinary Australians, there is a lot that we can do. It's not something that's happening over one side of the world that we should be ignoring. And people are incredibly fearful about the amount of loss that could happen in the coming days.
Larissa, your scarf, I can't not notice it. You obviously feel pretty strongly about this issue. Yep. There were big protests on the weekend of people who clearly feel similarly. Obviously, there might be different views across the spectrum. But on that point that Roger made, that Israel is trying to defend its citizens, if there is a ceasefire, it can't take out Hamas, can it?
For First Nations people, there's an incredible solidarity that exists here, and we are talking about securing a free future for Palestine. We're going to talk about the freedom to continue your language, your culture, and not just to survive, but to thrive as people. And so for First Nations people, we, the day after a devastating referendum loss, are out there campaigning and protesting and calling for peace. Palestine is not Hamas. Palestinians are not Hamas. And so you can condemn the acts of violence, but at the same time, we need to say, we need to look at a future where we do have a peaceful resolution here, and we can't just say that there's no room for negotiation. This is one of the most populated areas in the world. Over 50% of the population are children. They are not armed, and we need to say, we can say that what happened is a war crime, but that doesn't justify war crimes going back and forth either side.
Okay. Keith, I'm just going to let everyone have a chance to answer that question because it was framed in such simple terms. If you were Israeli Prime Minister, what would you be doing?
Well, it's not just if I was the Prime Minister of Israel, if I was the Prime Minister of Australia or any other nation. Defend the nation and its people. Make sure that you do everything you can to bring back 200 citizens who have been taken as hostages. And if you want something to happen right now, well, release them. Let them go. We hear a lot of discussion, PK, about pro-Israel, pro-Palestine. I'm just anti-terrorist, right? This is just outrageous what's happened. And no one wants this to escalate. They do not. Just release the hostages. That's the first thing that should happen.
Adam?
Well, this has moved beyond self-defence into now collective punishment of the people who are in Gaza. There's over 2 million people fenced into an area half the size of Canberra. 40% of them are children. They are being dehydrated, starved, bombed, and they've run out of fuel. Their hospital system is on the brink of collapse, and there's 50,000 women in there who are about to give birth who are now wondering how it's going to happen. This is going to become a humanitarian catastrophe. We should not be backing an invasion of Gaza. We need to see a ceasefire. The hostages need to be released. We mourn the loss of the 1,400 Israelis who've been killed, but also the 4,000 Palestinians who've been killed already. And if you want to see that number not grow any further, we need a ceasefire, we need to stop to the invasion, and then to have a just and lasting peace so that people in Israel and Palestine can live in the just peace and security that we all take for granted and that they're entitled to. The Israeli government needs to end the occupation of the Palestinians.
Okay. Next we'll hear from Saim Saeed.
As someone who comes from a predominantly pro-Palestinian part of Sydney, my community has felt betrayed by the government, believing the response has been very one-sided and unfair towards them, as seen when the Opera House was lit up with the Israeli flag. Could the government have been more sympathetic towards Palestinian people at a time of heightened tensions?
Matt?
Well, I think that we've been a government that has been quite progressive when it comes to the rights of Palestinians in terms of government policy. We've said in our platform that we recognise the right for a Palestinian state to exist behind secured borders. We've changed the language around the Palestinian territories to the occupied Palestinian territories. And we've been very supportive of humanitarian aid to advance the living standards of Palestinians. I think most Australians were quite shocked and horrified at the brutality of the Hamas invasion. And we've certainly made the point in the Parliament that our condemnation was directed to Hamas, the terrorist organisation, not to the Palestinian people, who in many respects are innocent victims in this whole conflict.
But
so we've
if
been
I
very
could just
clear
draw
on
you
that.
to the actual question, which was about, for instance, the Opera House being lit up in the Israeli flag colours. And I understand Clover Moore, the Lord Mayor of Sydney, has said no to lighting up the town hall in those colours. Your colleague again, Ed Husick, mentioned the lighting up in those colours in an interview with me and said that this had been, clearly it upset people. Do you think it was appropriate with the benefit of hindsight?
That's a matter for the New South Wales
But what do
government.
you think?
Well, there are guidelines that are put in place for decisions such as that to be made.
No, they're not. They're not. That's
there
a
are.
call.
There are guidelines.
That's ultimately a call, though.
There are guidelines, and those guidelines have to be followed. If we can just put aside that issue for a second, I do have a concern about the Opera House increasingly being used for particular purposes and means to support particular movements. And a classic example, I think, is that the Opera House has been used to promote a horse race, which directly benefited gambling companies. I don't think that that's an appropriate use of a public building where taxpayers' dollars are being expended. So there's a judgment calls. But the guidelines have to be followed.
But was it the right judgment call to light it up in those colours, in your view?
That's a decision for the New South.
I'm asking for your opinion.
That's a decision for the New South Wales.
So you just won't give me your view?
Look, I think in the circumstances, it was probably appropriate given the expression of support that existed in the Australian community for Israel and the motion that was passed in the Parliament. But I think we've got to be very, very discerning about using public buildings, particularly a public building that is devoted to the promotion of arts and culture in Sydney, discerning about using those buildings forever and a day for different causes.
Now, Larissa, I want to bring you in. I mean, many Israelis were murdered and it was horrific what happened to that community. By lighting up the Opera House, that was an act of Australian solidarity to the many people who'd been murdered. Do you understand why it happened in that context?
It's symbolism, but I would say people want substantive rights, not pretty lights. And so in terms of lighting up the Opera House in the aftermath of so much shock and grief, but also picking a side when there is an incredible outpouring from the Palestinian community trying to grapple with what has happened.
But was that a side? That was terrorists that murdered a whole lot of Israelis. It was a terrorist organisation that murdered.
I'm not justifying what Hamas did, but I'm saying that it goes deeper than just looking at Hamas and their actions. Supporting Israel and the things that Netanyahu has done over the last decade, I think his right-wing government, some of the comments they have made, which have frankly been genocidal in the last couple of weeks, of things that they have said about Palestinian people. I think what we want to see is not our politicians and our governments rushing to pick a side. What we want to see is negotiations. What we want to see is peaceful resolution. And I think that inflamed the situation. It caused a whole bunch of tension that, there's enough grief that was in the community in Australia. We've got lots of Palestinian, lots of Jewish people living in Australia. And I just think it was the wrong thing to do. I think there are many other ways to show solidarity for what was a horrific act, but I don't think in that moment that was the right thing to do.
I want to go back to you in a moment, but just get you in, Roger. I mean, a lot has been said about that, and clearly some Palestinians felt like their lives were not being counted. I know many Jewish people are pretty concerned that when this happened that it would get such a negative response when so many of their citizens had died. How do you view it? Was it provocative or was it just an act of solidarity?
I mean, I don't have a foot in either camp,
Yeah.
and so I don't think to me, it was a kind of non-issue. I think we have to. One of the things we're doing here at the moment is we're conflating the broader Palestinian issue with the actions of Hamas. And Larissa said Hamas is not Palestine.
No.
Palestine is not Hamas. That's correct. But Hamas has inserted itself inside Gaza. It's placed against all humanitarian law conventions, its headquarters, its missile firing posts inside populated areas. It launches rockets across hospitals within the safety zones of those rockets, and we saw what happened when one malfunctioned. So I thought the act of solidarity was with the act of solidarity for Israelis against Hamas, not against Palestinians. And I think people would do well to understand the difference between Hamas and what Hamas has done and how Hamas has to be dealt with, and the broader population of Palestinians and the broader Palestinian issue, which is related but separate to what we've seen just happen.
Simon, I want to bring you in. How do you feel about the kind of answers you got there?
Yeah, I'm happy with the answers. I was just like, there's still thousands of people protesting every single day about what's happened. So I would like you to comment on those protesters. Why do you think that they're still angry about the government response?
That's a good question. I'll bring you in, Keith. I mean, there are a lot of people on the streets who clearly feel like they're not being seen or understood.
And I think words really matter here, and I'll help Matt out. It was absolutely the right thing to do. It was, because it was about the fact that 1,400 people had been murdered, and Australia needed to show its solidarity. Can you imagine if this happened here in this country and it was 1,400 Australian citizens, what the Australian people would be asking its government to do? Can you just imagine what you would be asking Matt and his government to do in those circumstances? And in this panel, we've already heard words like war crimes and genocide. This doesn't need to be inflated. And I'll go back to the point I made first up. We have to look at how did the hostages get released? That is the number one priority right now. And I know
Isn't another priority, though, feeding and giving water to the desperate people who are so desperate? I mean, they're just not getting enough aid. We know that.
But, Patricia, no one wants to see the innocent harmed. That they don't. But this is an incredibly difficult position. And I just can't imagine what it would be like to have that occur here and have people come to me as an MP and the things that they would want us to do and how we would manage it. It's incredibly difficult. But I would say we need to be very careful with our language here, incredibly careful, because I take your point. There are a lot of people protesting on the streets, and I support their right to do that. But I don't support their right to use the language that they used a week ago. That is incredibly inappropriate and inflammatory, and I think everyone in the community needs to ensure that that stops.
Yeah, absolutely. And many of those other protesters did denounce it. Adam, I'll just let you have it, say.
I was part of those protests over the weekend, and there is a growing global push for peace here. Hundreds of thousands of people are now taking to the streets to say one atrocity does not justify another, right? And we cannot, when you stand up in Parliament and pass a motion to back an invasion of an area half the size of Canberra where 2.2 million people are walled in, you're effectively sanctioning an attack on a walled-in primary school, and there will be civilian casualties, right? And that's why I think at the moment, and you have the United Nations on the ground right now saying not only are the health system on the brink of collapse and they're running out of fuel and people are dehydrating and starving, but they're saying the invasion amounts to collective punishment, which is against international law, okay? And we mourn the 1,400 Israelis who've died, but 4,000 Palestinians and over 1,400 children have now been killed, and that number is going to grow, right? That number is going to grow. And there's practical things that we could be doing right now. And this movement for peace that is growing around the world is saying we want our world leaders to sit down, call a ceasefire, get the hostages immediately released and stop the invasion, because that is the only way that we're going to stop a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding, because it is going to get worse if we keep backing the invasion.
We'll keep this discussion going, and we've got a question now from Baldwin-Roberts. Hi, Paul.
Hi. As an Australian Jew, I've been comforted in recent weeks by the concern and support I've been given by the Australian public and by the government and opposition. Adam Band, are the Greens able to differentiate between terrorism and those fighting terrorism? And will the Greens disassociate themselves from the Australian protesters which call for a Palestine to replace Israel rather than to live in peace with Israel?
The Greens have condemned the actions of Hamas, did that immediately. That is a war crime. The taking of hostages is a war crime, and the perpetrators need to be held to account and and they need to be brought to justice. So we are crystal clear. We are crystal clear on that. And upholding the human rights of everyone is critical here. And to ensure that the people of Israel and of Palestine can live in a just peace and security, they have to be treated equally. And everyone is entitled to that. And what we have here, people are asking, how did Gaza come into existence? Well, there has been an occupation of Palestinian territories for a very long time that has pushed them into this open-air prison. We need a peace process so that both Palestinians and Israelis can live in the just peace and security that they're entitled to.
So just some clarity on that, and I'd love to come back to you in a moment, but there are some protesters, not all, but who seem to want Israel not to exist at all.
Well, if we're talking about, I don't know if this is what you were referring to, but if you're talking about the remarks that we heard from some at that first protest at the Opera House, that was denounced by the organisers as vile anti-Semitism, and I was crystal clear in Parliament. In Australia, we say no to anti-Semitism, no to Islamophobia, but we can also say no to war as well. And so here, Australia can play a role, especially in encouraging the United States to say, we don't want to be back here in 10 years' time. We need a just and lasting peace. We need Israelis and Palestinians to be able to live together, to self-determine their own futures so that they can live in peace and security.
Paul, you've heard from Adam Band's denouncement of anti-Semitism and some of the more radical or extremist things that you may have heard at these rallies. Does that satisfy you?
No, because we're not going to be back here in 5 years. We're going to be back here in months and years if Hamas is not dismantled. Their charter, their sole purpose of existence is to destroy the state of Israel and to kill all Jews in Israel and worldwide. It's openly stated in their charter. And so when you go to rallies and you speak at rallies where people say from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, the river is the Jordan and the sea is the Mediterranean. That is a call to wipe out Israel. It's on all the Twitter feeds of all the organisers. And by attending and supporting that, you're sending me a message as an Australian Jew that you are political bedfellows with organisations that seek the destruction of Israel.
Adam?
That's not my position, and that's not the Greens' position. What we're saying very, very clearly is that in this area where there has been an occupation of the Palestinian territories for a very long time, and it has been routinely, like the United Nations has been crystal clear that this is illegal, right? That this cannot continue. What we need then is to ensure that both Israelis and also Palestinians are able to live in a just peace and security. That is what the world community should be investing its efforts into, so that both can self-determine their own futures, because at the moment, that is not something that the Palestinians enjoy.
Okay, that's slogan from the river to the sea. Larissa, do you understand why some Jewish people find that really offensive?
Yeah, I understand that, but I also I don't believe that it is hate speech, and I think that in the way that I don't agree with that. I believe that Palestinians have a right to call for freedom, and I think there is a conflation that happens. And I think we've been talking about a two-state solution for a very long time, and I think that governments have walked away from the negotiation and holding, like, you can talk about Hamas, but the reality is that Netanyahu, governments need to be held to a higher standard. We need them to uphold international law. And so I understand why people say this and people see this as a call to freedom. I understand that you can see this in a different way as well. But at the same time, we need to make sure our governments take actions here. We have to have a ceasefire. You can say you want a ground invasion of Gaza, but where does this end?
Roger, I want to bring you in because what we're seeing in our audience, I think, tonight is a divide that's really happening in our community about the way that we frame these things and the language that we use, and some saying, no, this is anti-Netanyahu, this is not anti-Israeli people, but clearly that's not the way it's heard for many Jews. How do you understand it?
Yeah, I mean, it's as Risa said, I don't think there'd be anybody or many people in the audience that would consider the Netanyahu government to be a very good government. It's not a good government, but the Israeli people have the opportunity at the ballot box to get rid of the Netanyahu government at the next election. Palestinian people have no opportunity to get rid of Hamas in Gaza because there are no elections. Yep. And so when you talk about holding people to account, there is no holding to account of Hamas. And when we talk about we should have a ceasefire and negotiate, Hamas is not going to negotiate with you. It does not negotiate. And so while that all sounds really good in theory, in practice, the reality is it's not an organisation that you can negotiate with. It's got more than 200 hostages, including foreign nationals, and that was not an accident. And that's there for a bargaining chip, which they may or may not drip feed, which they will retain so that they can continue to put off an invasion or a ground incursion for as long as they can. And then they will use them in whatever way they want to use them during the period of the ground incursion. And I think we also have to understand that as well as the Israeli citizens that were killed on that day. There were 30 French citizens, 30 Thai nationals, 10 Nepalese. Hamas is not the kind of organisation, it's not a war crime what Hamas did, it's an act of terrorism. Yep. And it's an act of terrorism not only against Israeli citizens, but against citizens from 40 countries who are killed in it. And I think people have to understand that when they look at the situation. We can, myself included, have great sympathy for the Palestinian cause. And I think there has to be a two-state solution. I don't think anybody a rational person would think...
There is no other solution.
Correct. But Hamas is not part of a two-state solution. They don't want a two-state solution, and therefore you can't negotiate with them. So that is, unfortunately, the bloody reality of what's going to play out here.
And if this discussion is raising any difficulties for you or anyone you know, the numbers of Lifeline and Kids Helpline are on the screen, and use them, absolutely. I know it's been a hard conversation. Now I'd like to bring in Marcin Mazurek.
Thank you. The USA is increasingly involved in ongoing conflicts around the world. They have invested significant power in supporting the defense in Ukraine, and now they are involved in Israel. This raises concerns about their capacity to support Australia. Should Australia rely on US support during potential crises, or should we make greater efforts to enhance our own military capabilities?
Yeah, interesting question. Keith, I'll start with you. They certainly are very busy, the United States, at the moment. There's no doubt about it.
Thanks, Patricia. I mean, it's been a long-held position that the US's place in the world helps maintain peace and stability in the world order. That's just been the case for a long period of time. They are, without doubt, our greatest ally. They absolutely are. And Australia has stood with the US has stood with us. And I don't want to take any of Matt's thunder, but I know there's a significant change around our force posture. This is all public. I'm not talking about anything that I shouldn't be talking about, particularly to the north. And people are very concerned. Experts, and there'll be some at the table, and I'm looking at one in particular, know that we have challenges, whether it's into the Pacific, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's issues with Taiwan. All of those add pressure onto the Australian government, where it focuses its money and its budget and what it does. But everything I've seen says that we are increasing our force posture with changes to the north. We're looking at new technology, new equipment. But the US has been a long-term ally. It'll continue to be an ally into the future. And it's one which has been proven. So I think the United States is someone we can rely upon, as we can with the UK and others. but we need to ensure that we do maintain peace across the world because no one wants to see an escalation. What happened in the Ukraine, it's exactly the same, right? Putin just simply crossed the border and started shooting people. And I heard the comments earlier about the government's done this. The government hasn't done this. Weak men with guns kicked doors in and murdered the innocent. That's what's happened. And the point, I think, is exactly spot on. These are terrorists. They will not give up. That is their intention, to continue to do what they're doing. And I'll come back to the point I made earlier. If it was my loved ones, I'd want every single possible option being undertaken to go and get them.
Oh, absolutely. But equally, I think other people want their loved ones to have access to medicine.
Of course.
And this is the situation we're in at the moment. I want to acknowledge that every time because I do think right now there are Australians in the diaspora communities having a really difficult time. I know because they've told me. And I think we need to respect that. Adam Bown, I want to bring you in on this one because the Greens take a bit of a different position, really, to the two major parties on this.
Well, nearly everything.
Well,
not everything.
Except for voting with Labor, of course. Yeah.
Australia shouldn't be putting its defence of its country in the hands of Donald Trump, which is what being wholly...
He's not there.
Wholly reliant...
He hasn't been re-elected yet.
Well... By Australia saying that effectively our military will just be an offshoot of the US Army, then we are putting our sovereignty in the hands of whatever decision gets made in the US by the US people. Donald Trump has been president before. If he's president again, I don't want to rely on him for our defence and our security.
You prefer President Biden.
And I think at the moment... it's no wonder that Joe Biden's got a big smile on his face when Anthony Albanese's coming, because he's coming with an open chequebook, offering to write a $500 billion cheque for nuclear-powered submarines so that Australia can turn into an offensive arm of the US Army and US Navy. Right? Why does Australia need long-range submarines to be able to go and attack other countries further out? It's not for the defence of our country. It's so that we can be part of an offensive force the next time the US decides to go off to war. And Australia has followed the United States into every war, and many of them have ended very badly. In a cost of living crisis, imagine how much $500 billion could go to making it cheaper to go to the doctor or putting dental into Medicare, right? There's better things for Australia to be doing, and I think we should be making decisions, including defence decisions, about what is in Australia's best interests, what is going to de-escalate tensions in our region. We've got a good relationship with China, getting better relationship with the United States. It would be absolutely catastrophic if the United States and China went to war. Right? We could be playing a role in de-escalating tensions, and instead we're just throwing our lot in with one side that could be led by Donald Trump.
Well, the Prime Minister is going to go meet with President Xi Jinping imminently, so feel like that might be a thawing of the cold freezer. On that question of if we're too reliant on the United States, especially when they're quite busy in a couple of theatres of war, Matt, is that where we're putting too many of our eggs in one basket?
The security alliance with the United States and indeed New Zealand, ANZUS, has been the foundation of Australia's defence and security since World War II. And I think it's served the nation well. It's produced relative peace and stability in our region, in our backyard, in the Pacific. And I don't believe that the Australian people want that changed. Having said that, we undertook a defence strategic review to look at the posture of Australia and our capability to defend our people into the future. And that review indicated that we do need to develop a sovereign capability, particularly around a number of areas, and we're doing that with the AUKUS arrangement, developing a nuclear-propelled submarine capability. We're developing a sovereign manufacturing industry for munitions, investing in better helicopter equipment with Black Hawks. But the most important investment that we're making is in our people, in the members of the Australian Defence Force. And we know that we need to grow that over the coming years and create rewarding and fulfilling careers for our ADF personnel. So the government's undertaking a number of reforms. We're looking at how we can support families. ADF members have to move around quite a bit through their deployments and postings. How can we support family members, kids that want a good education, partners that want to work? We're looking at reviewing defence housing. all aimed at improving our greatest asset, our people, and our capability into the future.
Right. If I can get just some brief comments from both of you, because I'm really keen to get to our questioners tonight. I'm very ambitious about our questioners. Larissa.
I think what Australians want is, when we come to foreign policy, we talk about, politicians talk about national security or trade. There are other things that we could be negotiating around foreign affairs, including things like climate change, is really important. And I think when we look at, in this country, we want to make sure that our leaders are upholding ethical and consistent and upholding international law in the way that we do our foreign policy. We don't want to see politicians out there mouthing off. Things like AUKUS is a huge investment from Australia. It deserved to go to the Australian people as a debate before it was decided by a politician that we were going to go invest in these types of things.
Roger?
Yes, I think it was a very good question, and it's also, I'd agree with much of what Adam and Larissa said. I think that it's very healthy to have a debate about these things, and there should be a healthy debate. The US alliance is a cornerstone of our defence posture, but I think more broadly than that, what we've been seeing over the past couple of years is a broader alliance of liberal democracies as well, not just a defence alliance, but that's grown out of these kind of defence alliances. So I think when we talk about these issues that rightly Adam and Larissa brought up, we should also look at one of the fundamental strengths of Australia's defence posture is the broader issue about our alliances with like-minded countries, not just the United States, but increasingly countries in Europe.
If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A Live with Roger Shanahan, Larissa Baldwin-Roberts, Matt Thistlethwaite, Adam Bant and Keith Pitt. On another topic now, let's change our topic. Here's Danny Alexander. Hi, Danny.
Thank you.
It's your moment.
Given the Prime Minister's trip to the US this week, how important do you believe it is that Australia's climate policy aligns with or is even embedded within our national security policy?
That's the point you were just making, essentially, wasn't it, Larissa?
It was. I think we need to look at, we are dangerously close or above 1.5, and I think when we talk about national security, we need to talk about our role in the Pacific region and what it means for our brothers and sisters. They talk about 1.5 to stay alive, and it is incumbent on us to make sure our governments, we are one of the largest exporters of fossil fuels in the world. It does matter where you send it to be burned, and we need to make sure that we are decarbonising and supporting other people to do that as well as making sure that we are giving aid and paying for loss and damage across the Pacific.
That's an interesting point. I'm going to bring you in, Keith, because one of your Nationals colleagues is essentially at the moment, Matt Canavan, saying net zero is dead.
I was hoping you'd narrow it down. That's good, yeah.
Oh, no, I'm here to help. Net zero is dead. Do you share that view?
Well, I think I've got a number of views, as I'm sure you're aware.
That one, though.
So let's look at what's happening around the world to start with. So the UK has walked back from a lot of their commitments because they're just not achievable, and the cost, the price to the people of the United Kingdom, they can't afford to pay it. We've seen areas like Germany. Germany just undertook the build of an LNG import platform at one of their ports, which they did in 24 weeks because the German Parliament had to go and basically eliminate all legislation to make this happen because of what's happened with Russia and Ukraine. They would have lost their gas supply and their people would have died from exposure. So I'm always about balance, and I just want to see our response be proportional to our contribution. And I want the people that I represent, and keep in mind, if I remember correctly, per capita income for my people is about $35,000 a year. They cannot pay. So if there are massive increases in power prices, in the price of a vehicle, and what it costs for fuel, for them to go to work, the price of housing, and keep in mind policies like the safeguard mechanism will drive up the price of concrete. It has to, because they have legacy equipment which cannot be changed, that has to be replaced,
but on the substantial question that I asked,
yes?
Do you support net zero by 2050?
Well, as I've just said, I support doing things proportional to our contribution.
Do you support
we
it
have
or
a contribution of 1%. There's been commitments made by governments, including this government and the previous one. But I'm a practical guy. I want to know how this is going to work and what it's going to cost. And if
you're a politician. You're meant to actually make it happen.
I'm an electrician, an engineer, I'm all sorts of things. And I'm happy to answer. So, as I've just outlined, if it costs my people more than they can pay, well, of course I'm not going to support it. That's my job, right? They send me to Canberra to protect them from policies that hurt them. And I hear all of the other arguments. I mean, China's out building, I think if I remember, more than 300 gigawatts of coal-fired power stations. That's just a reality. India is very, very similar. Australia's contribution is actually really small, but you have to look at who's paying the bill and their capacity to pay it. And the people I represent simply can't.
Who's
and
paying the bill? That's nothing about the $30,000 per year that farmers are already losing as a result of the climate crisis. Nothing about the people who still haven't been able to get back into their homes.
Where did that number come from, Adam?
They've been from
let
ABS,
Adam
from your
talk
government.
now.
Nothing. It was released under your government. Nothing about the people. Nothing about the people who still can't get back into their homes because of the floods that devastated them.
And
nothing about
coal
the
will
fact.
stop that in
nothing
Australia?
about the fact
No bushfires?
that in
Close one power station?
October, Australia is burning. Coal and gas are fueling the climate crisis, and you did more than anyone in your time in Parliament to make that worse, and it is hurting people. Right? It is hurting people. And to answer the question, I agree with Australia's former defence chiefs who say that the single biggest threat to Australia's national security is the climate crisis. And you just need to look at our region. You just need to look around our region and think about what is going to happen to the millions of people around our region when they're no longer able to feed themselves or have clean drinking water, to understand the kind of instability that is going to drive. And Labor is keeping secret a report that they commissioned about the national security implications of the climate crisis. They're sitting on it and they won't release it to you. The US releases theirs, but Labor won't release it to the Australian people.
You've just brought Labor in, so now I have to...
Why? Because they want to keep
speak.
opening more coal and gas, which will make Australia less safe.
Matt, why aren't you releasing it?
The Defence Strategic Review clearly outlined climate change as a major national security issue, and that's why the government is acting with stronger policies to combat climate change. All the policies that we've put in place, massive investments in solar, in community batteries, electric vehicles, a safeguard mechanism to ensure that the biggest polluters have a clear pathway to reduce their emissions over time. We get it that climate change is a massive national security issue, and that's why the Defence Department is putting together a climate change strategy that will be released next year. The other point to make about climate change and our defence forces is that increasingly the ADF is spending time on cleaning up after natural disasters. Now, they do a very good job at it, but that's not the job that they signed up to be members of the Australian Defence Force for. And every day that they're spending cleaning up is a day that they're deferred from training to defend our nation. And that's why the government is investing close to $40 million in an organisation called Disaster Resilience Australia, which is training up veterans who have retired from the ADF to be involved in this disaster recovery and resilience program. So we are doing the most we possibly can to ensure that our defence forces take this issue seriously and that we are reducing emissions over time.
Why are you opening new coal and gas mines?
All of the projects... So all of those projects have to fit within the government's policy of net zero by 2050 and the safeguard mechanism. It's up to the proponents under law to demonstrate that. Otherwise, the project won't be approved. And this government has rejected 3 proposals for new coal mines.
Okay.
It's rejected 3 proposals for new coal mines because they did not fit within those rules of net zero by 2050 and reducing Australia's emissions. The other thing, of course, it was that we're investing heavily in renewables. So we're changing our energy mix gradually over time so that the economy makes a clear transition to more renewables.
Now to a question from Amy Gordon.
In light of the recent devastation following the Black Summer bushfires and the present El Niño weather event, are our governments looking into First Nations methods of environment preservation, such as coal burning?
Really great question from a school student too. Very impressive. The kids are going to save us. Larissa.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy. I want to live in a world where fire sticks, fire management is really important, but what I want for Australian school kids to learn is to understand why land rights is a solution to the climate crisis. 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by Indigenous peoples globally, and that means we live in proximity to these really climate vulnerable places. we have a culture that's about land management. It's more sophisticated than just going out and bushfire, doing backburning and those types of things in different types of weather. It is bushfire season now, but I think what we need to understand in this country is that all the respect that we have for lifesavers, for the state emergency services, that Indigenous rangers do an incredible job. And even if you talk to the best scientists in Australia, that adaptation works best when they marry Western science with Indigenous knowledges. And governments need to fund that. It needs to be, we need to talk about our native title legislation. There are lots of different reforms across this country, but land rights is the solution, and we need to talk about it more broadly than just Aboriginal people and fire sticks management. So thank you for your question, but it is incredibly important.
Can I just add there?
Yeah,
In the area that I represent, the Gamay Rangers in Botany Bay, they now work very closely with National Parks and Wildlife Service on cultural burning, and it takes place on a regular basis, and we're using the knowledge of the people that know that land and those waters the best, the Indigenous inhabitants whose ancestors have been there for thousands of years. And there's 82 Indigenous protected areas across the country where this is starting to happen a lot more. So I think that by listening to First Nations Australians, we can get better outcomes.
Keith,
very briefly, Patricia, I rang a guy called Darren Chester today. He's the member for Gippsland. He's been through a lot of these, just to confirm my recollection was correct. And pretty much every report, every Royal Commission has said the same thing. The fuel load was that high at the time of these big fires because governments hadn't maintained hazard reduction burning. So whether it's this method, whether it's other methods, to be honest, I don't care as long as governments keep up with what they have to do. Because the bigger the fuel load, the hotter the fire, the bigger the fire, the more damage it does, the more people are killed, the more losses there are. And these are the things that governments have to make sure are actually delivered, and they haven't been, and they're still not being delivered. Where I come from in Queensland, there's regulation that prevents them from clearing further than, from memory, 10 metres around their house without a development approval. Now, when the fire is enormous and running at 1,000,000 miles an hour, that is not going to help you. So we've got to be far more practical. And if it's this method that helps, that's great. We'll take them all. If you live in the bush, these things really matter.
You can't burn your way out of the climate crisis, Keith.
So,
no matter how many. So
your clothes are roaring and we'll never have a bushfire. Is that what you're saying?
Pro-scientific management of hazard reduction burns always have been. But the best thing to do is to stop making the problem worse.
How many
stop opening up new coal and gas mines. Stop burning coal and gas.
Okay.
But we don't need new coal and gas. There is enough already in the system.
Won't stop a single
and the more
fire.
that we open coal and gas mines, the more forests and trees that are going to burn, including over this coming summer.
Now, next, let's hear from Justin Whittle.
Thanks, BK. In light of the referendum, the phrase truth-telling has been used frequently. What does a truth-telling process entail, and how would the panel ensure that it is conducted respectfully within society?
Larissa, I'm going to start with you.
The referendum. I have been inundated with calls from every single day, friends and family talking about what happened in the referendum. It's devastating for our communities, regardless of what the question was. I think that the rejection that we feel from the Australian voters, and truth-telling is important, but I just don't know where we go from here. And I think truth-telling is one way, but it also still feels like an olive branch that is being extended from our communities to the broader Australian public. How do we move forward? People asking about reconciliation. Personally, I think reconciliation is over. It's time for a reckoning. We cannot have reconciliation with people who do not say that we exist in this country, who are not talking about the truth of what has happened. Some of the lies that were perpetrated throughout the referendum, from things around cultural heritage and farmers talking about not needing to know how to build a fence and that sort of stuff, and the idea that this would mean more substantive rights. I had a call from one of my cousins and he said, I knew that this would happen. And I was like, it was going to happen. But no, he's talking about that state governments were going to take treaty off the table. And I just think the truth-telling that needs to happen here, we need to see substantive rights in this country. We need to make sure that First Nations people have the same access to health, housing and education as everybody else. This misinformation about $40 billion in Indigenous affairs, everyday Australians have a responsibility to push back on that rhetoric and understand that that is just a portion, that is what is expected. No one is going after regional communities, no one's going after the funding for seniors or disabilities. But right now we are seeing attack after attack in the week after the referendum on our communities. And truth-telling is one part, but also it is showing up as Australian voters that are willing to say, who are we going to be as a country and what is my role in this? Because if you're not going to vote in our favour, I just don't understand how we get any political power here. And we need to be able to choose our own representatives like everybody else here.
Roger, it's up to you to declare, but I think you didn't support the referendum, is that right?
Yeah, no, I'm in the Prime Minister's electorate, so I think it was nearly 80% voted yes. I was one of the 20% that voted no. And
you must feel really comfortable in that electorate.
yeah. But, so if you put me in a room with 10 people from the electorate, myself and one other person voted no. If you put me in the room in Australia, myself and 5 other people voted no, for all a different variety of reasons. Yeah. My personal reason why I voted no was I couldn't accept the argument as to why it couldn't be legislated first and then when everybody was comfortable with it, then go to referendum, because people are conservative when they vote about the referendum, and we all know that. So I wasn't against the voice. I didn't know what the voice was. I wanted to see it in a legislated manner first.
But now we don't get anything.
It can never be legislated.
Well, never say never.
It can never be legislated.
Well, no. Well, I mean, yeah.
What government is going to legislate something that failed at a referendum like that? And I think there is a piece.
Not this government.
Well, no, because it also
maybe a government.
But how long do we have to wait?
But this is my question. So this is my viewpoint was, if you want to bring the nation along to an idea, which is the voice, I think people generally were reasonably disposed to it. And I think this thing about misinformation, I think we need to put that into perspective. Misinformation doesn't result in every state in Australia giving you a 61 to 39% split. So I think people just didn't understand what it was, and whatever that failure was.
So let's not pore over that.
Correct.
What next? Can you understand why Indigenous Australians are so cranky? They feel really upset.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I don't have an answer for what next.
But
I don't think Australia really does.
It's also the power of Australian voters. You have everywhere except for the ACT, you have delivered a message to state and territory governments that Indigenous affairs don't matter. They don't matter to Australian voters. So how are we supposed to put our issues on the agenda?
That's not the message.
Sorry, Keith?
No, absolutely not. I mean, they're overwhelmingly supportive of doing things that matter, and they want kids to go to school.
Have you heard the coalition MPs over the last week saying no, treaty can wait, treaty can't happen?
I am one,
But there has been a rolling back of lots of Indigenous people's demands, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
But in terms of actual outcomes, the people I talk to, and I had an Aboriginal elder come to see me, and I didn't even know he was an elder, and we had a chat about the voice, and he was opposed, and I said, well, why is that, mate? And his answer was really simplistic. He said, we just all got to get along.
Okay,
and then away he went.
Now we've got figures. Let me just take you to the figures.
But hang on.
Aboriginal communities, and you know it, even in very no electorates, the Indigenous booths voted yes.
So in Lingiari, the turnout was just over 50%.
In all of the remote booths, they voted yes.
53% of them voted. That's all.
In the remote booths, they voted yes. How does that sit with you?
I want to see outcomes.
No, but that particular point...
Do you think we don't want outcomes?
So, but this is the way they voted. This is how our democracy works. And I think your summary was pretty close. What do I want to see? I want to see kids go to school. I want to ensure that when they get an earache, they don't lose their hearing because it's not addressed. I want to see decisions like the CDC. Now, people don't agree with that in some places, but it worked and it was overwhelmingly supported by local communities, and it's gone. So these are actual measures that work.
So let me put this to you. Treaty has been taken off the table. We didn't vote on that, did we?
Well, it's been taken off the table by state governments.
Yeah,
and state
but we didn't vote on that, did we?
No, not at all.
So why has it happened?
Well, it's a question to ask them.
But what do you think?
Well, what I think is the overwhelming majority of Australians didn't agree with the proposition. They were very, very... And I thought your summary was spot on. They overwhelmingly want to help people, but they don't want to change the Constitution They don't want to see the Constitution be different for different individuals in Australia, and that's what they
All right.
did. They
Heath,
voted.
we've got to get to another
You've
question,
still got
but
a
Adam?
video
Yep.
posted on your Facebook page that says if we vote yes to the voice, it'll be the end of private property in Australia.
Yeah.
I mean,
So-
no, it's still there. It's still there. Go and have a look. No, hold on. Oh, you've had your go. You've had your go.
Well, hang on a minute.
We saw... I just want to acknowledge the hurt that Larissa has just outlined. It's a hurt that many First Nations people are feeling right around the country, and it's real. And we can't leave First Nations justice in limbo at the moment. And one of the things that became clear during the campaign was that Peter Dutton and the Liberals waged a Trumpian campaign of misinformation that has set back reconciliation, right? And it's still there on your Facebook page, Keith. And so one of the things that truth-telling now will deliver to us, and why we want to see the truth-telling process now started at a federal level, is that it will provide a platform, like it's doing in states like Victoria, to bring people together so that they can tell their story about what the history of Australia and colonisation has meant for them. And I feel that recommitting to those elements of truth-telling will provide the platform for people to understand what colonisation has meant for First Nations people around the country and lay a deep foundation for us to respect First Nations sovereignty and strike a treaty with First Nations people. I think we need a pathway forward, and it is too important to leave First Nations justice in limbo.
Okay. Matt, just a brief comment from you before we move on.
Well, obviously, it's disappointing that the referendum failed, and I was a strong supporter of the yes case, but the government accepts the decision of the Australian people. As to the way forward, I think that we need to now work and consult with First Nations Australians and try and work out that direction moving forward. I think people are forgetting that this has been a 10-year process to get to this point. This process started under the Abbott government in 2012 around the issue of constitutional recognition. And it was First Nations Australians that came together in 2017 at Uluru and came up with the roadmap forward through a voice to Parliament. And it's a shame that that's gone down, but we'll now continue to consult with and work with First Nations Australians to try and get better results. And you have to do that by listening.
And to finish tonight's discussion, here's Samuel Lightfoot.
With a failed referendum on the voice to Parliament, will we see an Australian government brave enough to put forward a referendum for Australia to become a republic in the next 10 years?
Did you know that Matt Thistlethwaite's entire job is to work on this?
Until tomorrow.
So, will we see one? Really?
The referendum on the weekend has made it a lot harder. There's no doubt about that. And the government's priority at the moment is assisting Australians with cost of living relief. There's a lot of Australians, and this became evident, I think, during the referendum when I was door knocking. A lot of Australians are dealing with cost of living pressures. You've got a couple of parents working, looking after a couple of kids. They hadn't focused on the issue as much as we would have liked. So all of our policies that we've been rolling out over the last 18 months have been aimed at helping people with that. Having said that, the government has a long-term vision for Australia as a mature, independent nation with one of our own as our head of state. When we developed our constitution, we were British to the bootstraps. We sang God Save the Queen as our national anthem. We had British currency. We all had British passports. We were British subjects. That's not the case anymore. We are Australians and we make our own decisions and we do it very well. The other point is that the way that we choose our head of state at the moment is the complete antithesis of the way that we make decisions in this country. And we made one last weekend. As hard as it is for people like myself and Larissa, it's democratically decided. Our head of state selection is not democratic at all. Someone is born into that privilege and that position, and that does not represent modern-day Australia.
So I've only got a minute left till we must say goodnight. So to that question, I'm going to whip around and you're going to give me a yes/no. Do you think we're going to see an Australian republic in the next 10 years?
Unlikely in the extreme.
No, and not after that one.
Adam?
I could have a crack at a treaty and a republic.
Yep.
That's very optimistic.
Matt's assistant ministry won't last past the next reshuffle.
And do you support an Australian republic?
No, I'm a monarchist.
So Are you happy then that this defeat probably puts that back?
Not at all. I mean, as I've said, I wasn't. I was actually quite saddened that the result got to where it was on the weekend, and it should never have been put in that form.
Why did you oppose it?
Okay.
But that's exactly why we opposed it.
Well,
because we didn't accept
can't
it.
re-prosecute all of that, but I can bring you the result of our online poll now. We asked you, after the defeat of the Voice referendum, will Australia ever become a republic? Almost 10,000 of you responded. Here's how you voted. 41% of you say yes. 45% say no.
You might survive, Matt.
There you go.
And 14% are unsure.
There's hope.
And that's all we have time for tonight. Thanks to our excellent panel, Roger Shanahan, Larissa Baldwin-Roberts, Matt Thistlethwaite, Adam Band and Keith Pitt. And thank you for sharing your stories and your questions. Next week, I'll be with you live from Melbourne. We'll be tackling the thorny issue of artificial intelligence and what it means for our future. Joining the panel, CSIRO boss Doug Hilton, tech entrepreneur Katrina Wallace, AI expert Toby Walsh and journalist Rad Yo. Head to our website to register to be in the audience and that will absolutely stimulate your brain. Come along. Good night.